American murderer Ed Gein digs up plenty of bodies and body parts in Monster, the Ed Gein Story. But the one thing the series fails to unearth is the truth. In fact, this installment of Netflix's Monster series is so ridiculously inaccurate that it's more fan fiction than fact. It's a twisted fantasy created by showrunners Ryan Murphy and Ian Brennan, the duo behind Glee and the first two installments of the Monster series. In this video, I'm going to reveal all the ways that Monster butchers Ed Gein's true story, as well as explain the few things that it actually gets right. This is Monster, the Ed Gein Story, History versus Hollywood. In terms of historical inaccuracies, we need look no further than the series' opening scene, which depicts Charlie Hunnam's Ed Gein engaging in autoerotic asphyxiation, which leads us to our first question. Did Ed Gein engage in this practice in real life? In the series, Ed's mother, Augusta Gein, portrayed by Laurie Metcalf, chastises him after catching him in the act. The entire scene sets the tone for the series, but the only problem is that it never happened in real life. Ed Gein biographer Harold Schechter told the New York Post, "There's no evidence whatsoever that Ed Gein ever enjoyed that particular activity." And despite Monster, the Ed Gein Story showing plenty of interactions between Ed and his mother, we don't really know what went on between them other than a few things Ed said about her in his confessions. In Harold Schechter's biography titled Deviant, The Shocking True Story of Ed Gein, the original Psycho, he created imaginative reconstructions to depict what might have gone on between Ed and his mother Augusta, and the Netflix series creates its own fictional and more exaggerated interpretations of their possible interactions. With regard to Ed Gein's family, the Netflix series depicts Ed getting into an argument with his brother Henry over their mother, who Ed worships but Henry sees as overbearing and unhealthy for Ed. The scene ends with Ed striking Henry over the head with a piece of wood and killing him. He later stages a brush fire to cover up the crime. A fact check reveals that Ed's older brother Henry Gein's official cause of death was asphyxiation during a brush fire on the family's farm in Plainfield, Wisconsin. Ed and Henry had been burning marshland vegetation on May 16, 1944, when the fire spread uncontrollably. According to reports, Ed escaped unharmed, but Henry was lost in the blaze. Ed gathered a search party together that included Deputy Sheriff Frank Engel. According to news reports at the time, they discovered his brother's body lying face down on scorched ground. The body was unburned, and there was soot on Henry's clothes. There were funny bruises on Henry's head, and he appeared to have been dead for some time. The medical authority at the scene, which included the county coroner, determined that the cause of death was asphyxiation and no autopsy was performed. Like in the series, there was little reason at the time to suspect that Ed, who had been seen as a meek little man, was involved in his brother's death. Suspicions that he may have killed his brother arose years later in 1957 after his arrest for murder. Gein biographer Harold Schechter writes that the brothers' tensions over their domineering mother added to the suspicions of foul play. Ed idolized their mother while Henry criticized her. Likely further fueling this tension was the fact that Henry planned to marry, despite their mother's belief that women were wicked and romantic and physical relationships should be avoided. Henry also owned 40 acres of the family farm, with her mother Augusta owning the rest, which could be another possible motive for Ed, as he would then become the sole heir to the property. One theory was that Ed killed Henry and staged the fire to cover it up. This is how Monster, the Ed Gein Story, chooses to depict Henry's death, but in doing so, it's utilizing creative license. Ed always maintained his innocence. Like in the series, Ed's brother Henry's death left their mother distraught, and later that year, she suffered her first stroke. Toward the end of the following year, in 1945, Augusta Gein died from a second stroke shortly after berating a woman who had been in the nearby home of a man named Smith. Ed and his mother Augusta had gone to the home to purchase straw, not collected debt, as is shown in the series. Smith, who was well known for his short temper, was outside the home beating a puppy, and the woman came out onto the porch yelling for him to stop. The man refused, and he beat the dog to death. But that's not what bothered Augusta the most. Instead, she called the woman Smith's harlot, since the two were not married. Augusta Gein passed away less than a week later, on December 29, 1945, not immediately after yelling at Smith and the woman. She reportedly died in her home. Ed had lost the only person he had any sort of real connection to. While his mother was very much the cause of many of his troubles in his mind, she was also the only person who had kept them at bay. With Augusta Gein gone, Ed's demons began to surface. It's true that he began digging up graves, in part to find a corpse that resembled his mother. According to Time magazine, Gein watched the obituaries to target fresh graves to rob. He exhumed the bodies of 9 or 10 women from 3 local cemeteries, Plainfield, Hancock, and Spiritland. Yes, one of the cemeteries was actually called Spiritland. He took various body parts, and in one instance, the entire corpse. It's true that one of the graves he dug up adjoined his mother's. The true story behind Netflix's Monster, the Ed Gein Story, confirms that he used female skin to make masks and bodysuits. He believed that by creating a woman's skin suit that resembled his mother, he could crawl inside and become her. It was a way he could keep her presence with him. He also modified furniture, including a chair and a lampshade, and he used human skulls for food bowls. As indicated in the series, the masks were the inspiration for the skin masks worn by Leatherface in the horror movie The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. The Netflix series implies that Ed got the idea for his morbid creations from reading about Nazi Ilse Koch, the wife of Karl Otto Koch, the commandant of the Buchenwald concentration camp. However, this is purely speculation on the part of the series creators, as well as Harold Schechter, the author of the Ed Gein biography, Deviant. Ilse Koch had indeed lived luxuriously amid the camp's atrocities, where over 56,000 prisoners died. She was accused of selecting tattooed prisoners for execution to harvest their skin for lampshades, book covers, gloves, and other ghastly creations like shrunken heads. Ilse's trial was reported on by the American news media, but Ed Gein never made any statements about her or that he was influenced by her alleged war crimes. While she was mentioned in pulp magazines and comics, there was never a comic book titled The Bitch of Buchenwald. The moniker stemmed from her documented cruelty at the camp. However, many of the most lurid accusations against her, like mass production of human skin items, were later debunked or unproven at her trials. Ilse Koch is mentioned in Schechter's biography of Gein, in which he depicts Gein reading a pulp magazine that features a story about the atrocities committed by Koch. However, Schechter has stated that while his book does not deviate wildly from the truth like the Netflix series, it is a work of creative nonfiction, meaning Schechter took some liberties to fill in the gaps in what we know about Ed Gein's life. The person who introduces Ed Gein to the stories of Ilse Koch in the series is Gein's girlfriend, Adeline Watkins. While Adeline was indeed a real person, her relationship with Ed Gein is grossly exaggerated in the series. The series' depiction of the romance is loosely based on Watkins' initial claims about her and Gein's relationship after his crimes were discovered on November 16, 1957. It was then that she told the Minneapolis Tribune that she and Gein had dated for over 20 years, calling him good and kind and sweet. She also claimed that they'd regularly talked about murders that were in the news. Eddie told how the murderer did wrong, what mistakes he had made. I thought it was interesting, she said. Watkins told the paper that Gein had tried to propose to her 2 years earlier in not so many words, but I knew what he meant. She said she turned him down, and that was the last time they saw each other. Her revelations, which were reprinted in newspapers across the country, particularly shocked the residents of Plainfield, who could not remember ever seeing Gein with a woman. Roughly 2 weeks after the story was published, Adeline Watkins changed her tune. In an article that appeared in the Stevens Point Journal, she retracted her claims about being in a 20-year relationship with Ed Gein, calling the earlier newspaper article an exaggeration blown up out of proportion to its importance and containing untrue statements. She said that though she had known Gein for 20 years, her romance with him lasted only 7 months and was intermittent. She said that they went to shows at the Plainfield Theater a few times, and he stopped at her home on some afternoons or evenings. Watkins said that she never went to his home. She added that prior to his crimes being discovered, she felt rather sorry for Gein. Unlike what's seen in Monster, the Ed Gein Story, there was never any evidence that she was his accomplice or ever knew about his crimes. In the final episode of this series, Adeline visits Gein and expresses to him her desire to become a killer, which is also total fiction. The series tries to get away with this by leaving us to wonder if the visit is part of Gein's imagination. According to Ed Gein biographer Harold Schechter, Their relationship, I'm pretty convinced, didn't really consist of anything more than possibly maybe Gein once asked her roller skating or something. They didn't really have a relationship. She was kind of a publicity hound. When all the media descended on Plainfield after the discovery of the crimes, she suddenly came forward as Ed Gein's girlfriend. In addition, Schechter told the New York Post that while Adeline Watkins is depicted as a beautiful young woman in the series, the real Adeline Watkins was much older and bears a striking resemblance to Margaret Hamilton in The Wizard of Oz. In the series, Gein becomes desperate to consummate his relationship with Adeline. She turns him down and encourages him to engage in necrophilia with a freshly dug up body instead. This is complete fiction. The real Ed Gein denied having sexual relations with the bodies. Schechter's Ed Gein biography states, he denied having sex relations with the bodies or parts of them as he declares the odor was offensive. Similar is stated in a 1957 Time magazine article. Gein practiced neither cannibalism or necrophilia, but preserved the remains just to look at. Schechter writes that Gein denied this several times when questioned. The Netflix series finds Ed Gein filling in for a local babysitter named Evelyn Hartley, who is ill with polio. According to author Harold Schechter, Ed did babysit local children in the past, but this was back when his mother was still alive and well before he committed the 2 murders attributed to him. This was also long before he started stealing bodies from the cemetery. Schechter notes that the children were always glad to see Ed. He would tell them creepy stories from the magazines he read and would even do silly magic tricks, but they were far from the macabre magic tricks he performs in the series, which are pure fiction. Gein is fired from his babysitting job in the series, and Evelyn Hartley returns after recovering from polio, which has left her with a brace on her leg. Evelyn Hartley was indeed a real person who disappeared in October 1953 while babysitting in Wisconsin, but investigators determined that Ed Gein was not involved. In reality, the disappearance happened while 15-year-old Evelyn was babysitting in La Crosse, Wisconsin, which was about 2 hours away from Gein's farmhouse in Plainfield. Ed Gein had been born in La Crosse and still had relatives there, but he claimed that he hadn't been back since his family moved when he was 7. Gein said that he had been doing some odd jobs for a neighbor on the day of Evelyn Hartley's disappearance. Evelyn was the daughter of a biology professor and had been babysitting the 20-month-old daughter of her father's colleague, Professor Viggo Rasmussen. Viggo, his wife Madeline, and their older daughter Rosalind were at the La Crosse State College homecoming football game, a popular event in town. Like in the series, the intruder is believed to have snuck into the Rasmussen home by forcing open a basement window. The scenes in the series where Gein stalks Evelyn and blames her for being the reason he lost the babysitting job, which culminates with him sneaking into the home and abducting her, are entirely fictional. There's no evidence Gein had any connection to Evelyn at all, and after his arrest, he passed a polygraph test regarding her disappearance. While analyzing the fact versus fiction, we discovered that this series also fictionalizes the character of Evelyn. The real Evelyn Hartley had not recently recovered from polio. She did have a brother, Richard, who had died from polio 3 years earlier while serving in the Navy, but there is no record of her ever having had the disease. In the series, she is left with a handicap from the disease in order to up the drama. The disturbing sequence when Ed Gein murders Hartley with a hammer is also fictional and is meant to echo the hammer scene from Tobe Hooper's 1974 horror movie, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Series creators Ryan Murphy and Ian Brennan want you to believe that Gein inspired that scene in Hooper's film, but here again, they're just making up the connection, as there's no evidence that Gein ever killed anyone in that manner. In real life, Evelyn Hartley's body was never found, and the case remains unsolved. In terms of other movies Ed Gein inspired, he did loosely inspire Norman Bates' obsession with his mother in Psycho, but the series plays up this connection as being far more significant than it was in real life. For instance, no, Alfred Hitchcock did not cast Anthony Perkins in Psycho because Hitchcock could see that Perkins was plagued by inner turmoil as a closeted gay man. In reality, we know from both interviews and production notes that Hitchcock's decision to cast Perkins stemmed from his focus on Perkins' previous work including his roles in films like 1956's Friendly Persuasion, for which he won a Golden Globe, and 1957's Fear Strikes Out, which showcased his ability to portray complex, sensitive characters. Hitchcock felt that Perkins' boyish looks, nervous energy, and ability to convey psychological depth would be a perfect fit for the character of Norman Bates. And no, Hitchcock did not recreate Ed Gein's house on a studio lot and show it to Anthony Perkins as part of Perkins' preparation for Psycho. As most fans of the Alfred Hitchcock movie know, the Psycho house set was an original design inspired by Victorian Gothic architecture. It looks nothing like Ed Gein's farmhouse, which burned down in 1958 prior to the making of Psycho. The Psycho house is still standing on the Universal Studios lot and can be seen during the studio tour. In reality, Psycho was only loosely inspired by Ed Gein's crimes and his obsessive relationship with his mother. The inspiration was indirect through Robert Bloch's 1959 novel of the same name, which Bloch himself said wasn't heavily based on Ed Gein, but Gein rather was a starting point for his novel, which has its own unique narrative. The movie Psycho did create intense audience reactions, but not quite as severe as what's seen in the series. Moviegoers were shocked that Hitchcock would kill off the protagonist, portrayed by Janet Leigh, so early in the film. They were also shocked by the perceived violence of the shower scene, and it's true that there were reports of people walking out or screaming in fright. However, the depiction of people leaving the theater to vomit seems to be a bit of an exaggeration, and we found no reports to corroborate such an event. The more intense reaction to Psycho depicted in the series is due to the fact that it depicts the shower scene as being far more violent than it actually was. Instead of trying to recreate Hitchcock's masterful scene, which famously included no gore, as no blood is shown on the body or knife, Monster depicts the scene with both nudity and explicit violence. This is in part due to the scene being blended with one of Ed Gein's schizophrenic episodes. Instead of seeing Janet Leigh's character, we see Gein's girlfriend, Adeline Watkins, as the victim in the shower, and Gein as the killer, dressed as his mother. Another point where the series takes creative license is when it depicts Ed Gein engaging in cannibalism. As reported by Time magazine in 1957, Ed Gein claimed that he did not engage in cannibalism, and there was no evidence in real life to suggest as much. Furthermore, there were no reports that he ever gave human flesh to neighbors, pretending it was venison, as the show depicts. According to Rolling Stone, cannibalism is also unlikely due to the fact that the majority of the 9 women Gein dug up had been embalmed, making it even more unlikely that he would have tried to eat them. 2 more murders that the series fictionalizes as being tied to Ed Gein is when he kills 2 hunters with a chainsaw. In Monster: The Ed Gein Story, 2 lost hunters stumble upon Gein's farm. They enter the barn and discover Gein and the mutilated body of hardware store owner Bernice Worden. Shocked, they flee the barn, and Gein chases after them with a chainsaw. He catches up to them, takes time to put on his human skin mask, and then uses the chainsaw to kill them. He then dances around holding the chainsaw in the air, a la Leatherface in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the movie his story would loosely inspire. Not only is this a bit ridiculous, none of it happened in real life. There's no evidence that Gein killed the 2 hunters, Victor Travis and Raymond Burgess, in November 1952. When questioned about their disappearances after his arrest, he said that he was innocent of the murders and even passed the polygraph test. Gein also never murdered anyone with a chainsaw. The series creators are once again retroactively altering Gein's past to bolster his connection to Leatherface, the chainsaw-wielding horror movie villain whose crimes he loosely inspired. It's true that Ed Gein killed hardware store owner Bernice Worden. In Monster, Gein is depicted as engaging in a romantic relationship with Bernice Worden. They eat dinner at a diner and then sleep together. However, there's no evidence that they were ever romantically linked in real life. Author Harold Schechter states in Deviant that not long before murdering her, Gein asked her to go roller skating. Though she's depicted as being bawdy and flirtatious in the series, the 58-year-old grandmother was far more conservative in real life. She was a widow and a devout Methodist. As noted by Schechter, she was held in high regard by most of the community, despite her sharp tongue and at times snippy attitude. She was even the first woman to be honored as Plainfield's Citizen of the Week. In Netflix's Monster: The Ed Gein Story, actor Charlie Hall portrays Bernice Worden's son, Deputy Frank Worden. He investigates his mother's disappearance and discovers her mutilated body at Gein's residence. This deviates somewhat from the true story. Deputy Frank Worden indeed visited his mother's hardware store and discovered signs of the murder. However, he did not discover a gift box addressed to Gein, as they were not romantically involved. Instead, he found a sales receipt for antifreeze made out to Gein from that morning, which was the last transaction his mother had recorded. He also found an open cash register and bloodstains on the floor. On November 16, 1957, Waushara County Sheriff Arthur Schley and Captain Shephoister searched Gein's property, and Schley found Bernice's decapitated and mutilated body hanging in a summer kitchen, a shed-like room attached to the rear of the farmhouse. The two men also found plenty of other ghastly evidence. The series depicts Bernice's son, Frank Worden, as the one who discovers her body, but that's fiction. Frank was not at the scene when his mother's remains were discovered. In a later scene, Frank Worden is shown auctioning off Ed Gein's possessions. However, he was critical of the auction in real life, saying that it was disrespectful to the victims. Frank and his sister Miriam filed a $57,800 lawsuit against the Gein estate. Monster depicts Ed Gein pulling up to his home after the authorities have discovered his gruesome crimes. In a dramatic scene, he is attacked by Bernice Worden's son, Frank, as he's being arrested. None of this happened in real life. According to reports, Gein was arrested at the home of his friend Lester Hill, where he had gone to have dinner with Hill's family. The series' depiction of Ed Gein's life after his arrest while he's incarcerated in a mental hospital for the criminally insane is almost entirely fictional. It is true that not long after his arrest, Ed Gein was diagnosed with schizophrenia by court-appointed psychiatrists. He was initially deemed mentally unfit to stand trial. However, he would eventually be tried for the murder of hardware store owner Bernice Worden in November 1968, more than a decade after his arrest. The series depicts Ed Gein as playing a pivotal role in helping to solve the Ted Bundy murders. Ed Gein biographer Harold Schechter told the New York Post that the depiction in the series of Ed Gein helping to solve the Ted Bundy murders is wildly made up. Essentially, series creators Ryan Murphy and Ian Brennan thought it would be fun to make up a link between Gein and the Netflix series Mindhunter, which is based on real-life FBI agents John Douglas and Robert Ressler and their work for the agency's newly created behavioral science unit in the latter half of the 1970s. The series fictionalizes Douglas and Ressler interviewing Gein about Ted Bundy, but there is no record that the FBI ever talked to Gein. The scene is also supposed to be a fictional nod to Silence of the Lambs, which finds Jodie Foster's character interviewing the serial killer Hannibal Lecter to help catch the killer known as Buffalo Bill. The series depicts Ed Gein as a serial killer who we see commit multiple murders. However, only 2 murders have been officially attributed to the real Ed Gein. The first is a 54-year-old divorcee tavern owner named Mary Hogan, who he had been friends with, and the second is 58-year-old Bernice Worden, who operated a local hardware store. Gein was eventually only tried for the murder of Bernice Worden and was found guilty of first-degree murder. A subsequent hearing pertaining to Gein's sanity concluded that he was not guilty by reason of insanity. He was ordered to be committed to Central State Hospital for the criminally insane. As stated earlier, there was speculation that Gein killed his brother, Henry, but the official cause of death was asphyxiation. As for the other murders in the series, including babysitter Evelyn Hartley and the 2 hunters, Victor Travis and Raymond Burgess, there was never a link found between those murders and Ed Gein. The police did question him with regard to various missing person cases, but he passed a polygraph test. In fact, the real Ed Gein technically was not a serial killer, which traditionally had been defined as requiring at least 3 victims. You might now be wondering, if Ed Gein in fact was not a serial killer, how did he inspire all the serial killers in the series? The truth is, he didn't. That is all fiction. Biographer Harold Schechter told the New York Post he was not a serial killer because the term serial killer was specifically coined to describe a certain type of psychopathic sex murderer, an extreme sexual sadist like Ted Bundy or John Wayne Gacy, who derived erotic pleasure from torturing and then killing victims. That was not what Gein was about. He did kill these 2 women, but he executed them very swiftly. He was basically just interested in bringing their corpses home so he could dissect them. He was not a serial killer, and the notion that all these serial killers at the end were inspired by Gein, like Richard Speck, I feel pretty confident that none of them even knew who Gein was. They wouldn't have been inspired by him because he was not a serial killer. So overall, how accurate is Monster, the Ed Gein Story? On a scale of 1 to 10, in terms of historical accuracy, with 10 being the most accurate, we gave Netflix's Monster, the Ed Gein Story, a 2 out of 10. In fact, in my 20 plus years of researching movies and series based on true stories, Monster is possibly the most fabricated series I've researched. Yes, there are elements from Ed Gein's life in Monster, but each episode is filled with so much fiction that the show hardly resembles the real Ed Gein. Author Harold Schechter, who wrote what is considered to be the definitive biography of Ed Gein, said that he was never approached by showrunner Ryan Murphy to option his book Deviant. Schechter became worried that there was going to be a lot of unauthorized use of his book in the series. However, his feelings changed after watching it. Schechter told the New York Post, "There is some unauthorized use of my book, I feel, but the show veers so wildly from the reality of the case, so much of it is pure over-the-top fabrication, that now I'm mostly upset that all the people who watch the show are going to think they're seeing the true story of Ed Gein." Schechter said that each episode is approximately 90% fabrication. Schechter noted that the broad outlines of Ed Gein's life are there, including, and I quote, his relation to his domineering mother, the grave robbery, the making of these ghastly objects out of the body parts, and so on. Those are pretty accurate, but a very large percentage of the show is just made up. Either Murphy or Ian Brennan, who wrote it, just invented these outrageous things, which have no relationship to the true facts of the Ed Gein story. My jaw dropped at how shameless the whole production was, end quote. And it's not just Ed Gein's life that's heavily fictionalized. As described earlier, the series shamelessly fictionalizes the backstories of movies like Psycho, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and The Silence of the Lambs to imply that Ed Gein was more of an inspiration on those films than he actually was. Gein's life is also retroactively fictionalized to strengthen his connection to those films. For example, he never killed anyone with a chainsaw like the character Leatherface does in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, nor did he then dance around with the chainsaw above his head. The more the series goes on, the more ridiculous the mounting fabrications become. It's as if creators Ryan Murphy and Ian Brennan just said, F the true story, we'll make up something better, which seems to be Murphy's go-to strategy for better or worse. Obviously for worse in terms of historical accuracy. The result is that much in the same way that Ed Gein loosely inspired movies like Psycho, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and The Silence of the Lambs, in the end, he is similarly a loose inspiration for his own biopic, Monster, the Ed Gein Story. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more historical breakdowns of movies and series based on true stories, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Anchors away, my friends.